Sarah Martinez woke up at 5 in the morning, just like she had every day for the past 8 years. Her small cattle farm was her whole world, and she loved every single thing about it. The old red barn, the wooden fences, the green fields, and especially her 4 prize bulls. She had worked so hard to build this place from nothing, and now it was perfect. Her farm sat on 15 beautiful acres at the edge of town. When she first bought the land, there was nothing around except trees and empty fields. But 2 years ago, everything changed. A big company came and built a fancy neighborhood right next to her farm. They called it Willowbrook Heights, and every house looked exactly the same with perfect lawns and matching mailboxes. The new neighbors seemed nice enough at first. Some of them even stopped by to buy fresh eggs and vegetables from Sarah's garden. But then the Homeowners Association started causing problems. The HOA was a group of people who made rules about how everything in the neighborhood should look. They wanted every house, every yard, and every fence to be perfect. On this Tuesday morning, Sarah put on her old work boots and walked outside to feed her animals. The sun was just coming up and the air smelled fresh and clean. She could hear her bulls moving around in their pasture waiting for breakfast. Thunder was the biggest and oldest of her bulls. He was a massive black animal who weighed over 1,500 pounds. Lightning was younger but just as strong. Storm and Tornado were her other 2 bulls, and all 4 of them were like family to Sarah. As she walked toward the barn to get their food, Sarah noticed something strange. 3 people were walking around her property with clipboards and cameras. They wore matching blue shirts with official-looking badges. One of them was taking pictures of her barn. Another was writing notes about her vegetable garden. The third person was measuring something near her fence. Sarah stopped walking and watched them for a moment. These people were clearly not from around here. Their clothes were too clean, their hair was too perfect, and they walked like they owned the place. But this was her land, her farm, her home. Nobody had asked her permission to come here. She walked over to the fence line that separated her farm from the new neighborhood. The 3 strangers were still taking pictures and writing notes. They seemed very serious about whatever they were doing. "Excuse me," Sarah called out in a loud, clear voice. "Can I help you with something? This is private property." The 3 people turned around and looked at her. The man in the middle was about 50 years old with gray hair that was styled perfectly. He wore expensive glasses and had a watch that probably cost more than Sarah's truck. The woman on his left was younger, maybe 30, with blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. The man on his right was tall and thin with a notebook in his hands. But what bothered Sarah the most was the way they were looking at her. They had big smirks on their faces, like they knew something she didn't. They looked at her like she was some kind of joke. The man with the gray hair stepped forward and smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Good morning, ma'am. My name is Dennis Walsh, and I'm the head of the Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association Compliance Committee. These are my associates, Jennifer Parks and Michael Stevens." Sarah crossed her arms and stared at him. "Nice to meet you, but you still haven't told me why you're on my land without permission." Dennis Walsh's smile got bigger, and Sarah didn't like it at all. "Well, you see, we're here on official business. Your property is creating some problems for our neighborhood, and we need to document everything properly." "What kind of problems?" Sarah asked. She kept her voice calm, but inside she was getting angry. Her farm was clean and well-maintained. She took good care of her animals and her land. What problems could these people possibly have? Jennifer Parks, the blonde woman, spoke, up for the first time. "Your barn needs to be painted. That red color doesn't match our neighborhood standards. And your fences are made of wood, which looks old and rusty. Our residents expect better quality construction in this area." Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. "This is my farm, not your neighborhood. I've been here for 8 years. Your neighborhood has only existed for 2 years. I don't have to follow your rules." Michael Stevens, the tall man with the notebook, started reading from his papers. "Actually, according to county records, there's a small strip of your land that falls within our HOA jurisdiction. That means we have the right to inspect it and make sure it meets our community standards." Sarah knew this wasn't true. She had checked her property lines many times when she bought the farm. Every inch of her land was clearly marked and legally hers. But she could tell these people weren't interested in the truth. They just wanted to cause trouble. "You need to leave right now," Sarah said firmly. "This is my property and you're trespassing." Dennis Walsh laughed out loud. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but we have every right to be here. We're not trying to cause problems. We just want to help you make some improvements that will benefit everyone." "I don't want your help," Sarah replied. "I want you off my land." But the 3 HOA people didn't move. Instead, they went back to taking pictures and writing notes. Dennis Walsh pointed at Sarah's chicken coop and said something to Jennifer Parks. She wrote it down in her notebook. Then Michael Stevens took a picture of Sarah's old tractor. Sarah realized these people weren't going to listen to her. They thought they could do whatever they wanted because they had official-looking badges and fancy clothes. They thought she was just some country farmer who didn't know her rights. But Sarah was smarter than they thought. She had dealt with difficult people before. When she first started her farm, some people tried to tell her that a woman couldn't handle cattle and heavy equipment. She had proved them wrong. Now these HOA people were trying to push her around, and she wasn't going to let that happen either. "Fine," Sarah said quietly. "Stay as long as you want, take all the pictures you need. But remember this moment because things are about to change around here." Dennis Walsh smirked again. "Is that some kind of threat?" Sarah smiled back at him, but her smile was different from his. Her smile was the smile of someone who knew something he didn't. "No, Mr. Walsh. That's a promise." The 3 HOA people continued their inspection while Sarah watched from her porch. They had no idea what they had just started. They thought they could intimidate her with their rules and their official papers. But Sarah had something they didn't expect. She had 4 very large, very protective bulls who didn't like strangers on their territory, and tomorrow those bulls were going to get a lot more room to roam. The next morning, Sarah woke up hoping that yesterday was just a bad dream. Maybe those HOA people would realize they had made a mistake and leave her alone. But when she looked out her kitchen window while drinking her coffee, her heart sank. Dennis Walsh was back, and this time he had brought even more people with him. There were 5 people this time, all wearing the same blue shirts with HOA badges. They had more cameras, bigger clipboards, and what looked like measuring equipment. Sarah watched them spread out across her property like they were planning some kind of military operation. Dennis Walsh was clearly the leader. He pointed at different parts of Sarah's farm and gave orders to the others. One person started taking pictures of every single fence post. Another person was measuring the distance between Sarah's barn and the property line. A third person was making a list of all the farm equipment Sarah kept in her yard. Sarah put on her work clothes and walked outside. She needed to feed her animals, but she also wanted to see what these people were really doing. As she got closer, she could hear Dennis Walsh talking to his team. "Document everything," he was saying. "Every building, every fence, every piece of equipment. We need to show the county exactly how this property is bringing down our neighborhood values." Sarah felt her anger growing, but she tried to stay calm. "Good morning," she said loudly. "You're back on my property without permission." Again, Dennis Walsh turned around with that same annoying smirk on his face. "Good morning, Miss Martinez. We told you yesterday that we have the right to be here. We're conducting an official inspection." "An inspection for what?" Sarah asked. A new woman Sarah hadn't seen before stepped forward. She was older, maybe 60, with expensive jewelry and perfect makeup. "I'm Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, president of the Willowbrook Heights HOA. We've received multiple complaints from our residents about your property." Sarah crossed her arms. "What kind of complaints?" Mrs. Henderson opened a fancy leather folder and started reading. "Noise complaints about your farm animals, odor complaints about animal waste, visual complaints about unpainted buildings and rusty equipment, property value complaints about having a working farm next to our luxury homes." "Those aren't real complaints," Sarah said. "My animals are quiet. I keep my property clean. And I was here first?" Dennis Walsh laughed. "Being here first doesn't give you the right to ignore community standards. Your barn is painted bright red, which clashes with our neighborhood color scheme. Your fences are made of old wood instead of proper vinyl. Your equipment is stored in the open where everyone can see it. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. This is a working farm, not a decoration. I need my equipment and I need my animals. That's how I make my living. Well, maybe you should consider finding a different way to make your living, said Mrs. Henderson coldly. Somewhere more appropriate for farming activities. The words hit Sarah like a punch in the stomach. These people weren't just complaining about her property. They were trying to force her to leave her home, her farm, everything she had worked. For the next 2 hours, the HOA team continued their inspection. They measured everything twice. They took pictures from every angle. They even brought out a device that measured noise levels, testing it near Sarah's chicken coop when the chickens were making normal chicken sounds. Sarah tried to go about her normal morning routine, but it was impossible to concentrate with. 5 strangers walking around taking notes about everything she did. When she went to feed her bulls, Dennis Walsh and another man followed her, keeping their distance but watching everything. Those animals look dangerous, Dennis said to his companion. We should add that to our report. Dangerous livestock near a residential area. Sarah turned around quickly. My bulls are not dangerous, they're farm animals and they're properly fenced and cared for. They're huge, the other man said nervously. What if they get loose? What if they hurt someone? They won't get loose, Sarah replied. I've been raising cattle for 8 years without a single problem. But she could see that Dennis Walsh was already writing something in his notebook. He was probably making up stories about dangerous animals to use against her later. Around noon, the HOA team finally left, but not before Dennis Walsh delivered one more insult. Miss Martinez, we'll be sending you an official notice within the next few days. You'll have 30 days to address all the violations we've documented today. If you don't comply, we'll be forced to take legal action. What violations? Sarah demanded. I haven't violated any laws. HOA violations, Mrs. Henderson corrected. Community standards violations, property value violations. You'll understand everything when you read our official report. After they left, Sarah sat on her porch feeling defeated. She had worked so hard to build this farm. She had saved every penny to buy the land. She had built the barn with her own hands. She had raised her bulls from babies. This farm was her whole life, and now these strangers wanted to take it away from her. That evening, Sarah called her neighbor Bob Wilson, who owned the feed store in town. Bob had been helping local farmers for over 30 years, and he knew everyone in the area. Bob, I need some advice, Sarah said. The HOA from the new neighborhood is causing me serious problems. I heard about that, Bob replied. Dennis Walsh came into my store last week asking questions about you. Wanted to know if you had any permit problems or legal issues. He what? Sarah was shocked. Don't worry, I didn't tell him anything. But Sarah, these HOA people have a lot of money and lawyers. They've been pushing around other property owners, too. Old Jim Peterson had to repaint his entire house because they said it was the wrong color. But Jim doesn't even live in their neighborhood, Sarah said. That's what Jim said, too. Didn't matter. They found some old county rule that gave them authority over properties within a certain distance of their development. Sarah felt her heart sinking. So, what am I supposed to do? Bob was quiet for a moment. Well, you could fight them in court, but that takes time and money. You could try to compromise with them, but people like Dennis Walsh don't usually compromise, or what? Or you could remind them that this is still your property and you have rights too. Sometimes bullies like Dennis Walsh need to be shown that they can't push everyone around. After Sarah hung up the phone, she walked out to check on her bulls. Thunder, lightning, storm, and tornado were grazing peacefully in their pasture. They looked so calm and content, but Sarah knew they were also powerful and protective animals. She had been keeping them in the smaller pasture near her house for convenience. But her property was much larger than that. She owned 15 acres, including a big section that ran right along the back border of the HOA neighborhood. As Sarah looked at her bulls and then at the fancy houses in the distance, an idea began to form in her mind. Dennis Walsh and his HOA team thought they could walk all over her property whenever they wanted. They thought she was just a helpless farmer who would give up easily. But they were about to learn that Sarah Martinez wasn't helpless at all, and her bulls were about to get some new pasture to explore. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a new feeling in her chest. Instead of feeling worried or sad, she felt determined. The HOA people thought they could push her around because she was just one person with a small farm. But they had made one big mistake. They didn't know anything about her bulls. Sarah had been raising cattle for 8 years, and she understood these animals better than anyone. Thunder, lightning, storm, and tornado weren't just livestock to her. They were her partners, her protectors, and her friends. Each bull had his own personality, and Sarah knew exactly how they would react to strangers on their territory. Thunder was the leader of the group. He was 7 years old, weighed over 1,600 pounds, and had never backed down from anything in his life. When Thunder was younger, a pack of wild dogs had tried to attack Sarah's chickens. Thunder had chased those dogs for 2 miles until they never came back. He was gentle with Sarah, but he didn't trust strangers at all. Lightning was younger but just as strong. He got his name because he could move faster than any bull Sarah had ever seen. When Lightning decided to go somewhere, nothing could stop him. He was also the most curious of the 4 bulls. If something new appeared on the farm, Lightning always had to investigate it first. Storm was the quietest bull, but that made him the most dangerous when he got angry. He would watch and wait, studying a situation before he acted. When Storm finally moved, it was always with purpose and power. Sarah had seen him knock down a tree that was threatening the fence during a real storm. Tornado was the youngest and most energetic. He loved to run and play, but he also loved to show off his strength. If the other bulls were doing something, Tornado wanted to do it too, but bigger and louder. He was like the little brother who always tried to prove he was tough. All 4 bulls shared one important trait. They were extremely protective of their home and their human. Sarah had raised them from babies, bottle feeding them when they were sick, caring for them through injuries, and treating them like family. In return, they watched over her and her property like guardian angels. The bulls currently lived in a 5-acre pasture near Sarah's house. It was good grazing land with plenty of grass and a small pond for water. But Sarah's property was much bigger than 5 acres. She owned 15 acres total, and most of it was unused land that stretched all the way to the back border of the HOA neighborhood. Sarah had never moved her bulls to the back section because it was further from her house and harder to check on them every day. But there was nothing wrong with that land. It had good grass, and the fence line was strong and secure. More importantly, it was completely legal. Every inch of that land belonged to Sarah, and she had the right to use it, however she wanted. That afternoon, Sarah walked the entire back section of her property. She checked every fence post, every wire, and every gate. The fence between her land and the HOA neighborhood was in perfect condition. It was built to keep cattle in and people out, which was exactly what Sarah needed. As she walked, Sarah noticed several places where the HOA people had been trespassing. There were footprints in the mud near the fence line. Someone had left trash on her side of the property. There were even places where the fence had been damaged, probably by people climbing over it instead of using the gate. Sarah also noticed something else. The back section of her property had a perfect view of the HOA neighborhood. She could see the fancy houses with their perfect lawns and matching mailboxes. She could see the walking paths where HOA residents took their evening strolls. Most importantly, she could see exactly where Dennis Walsh and his inspection team liked to set up their equipment when they came to harass her. That evening, Sarah called her friend Maria Santos, who was a veterinarian in the next town over. Maria had helped Sarah with her bulls many times, and she knew more about cattle behavior than anyone. "Maria, I need some advice about moving my bulls to a different pasture," Sarah said. "Sure, what's the situation?" Maria replied. Sarah explained everything that had been happening with the HOA. She told Maria about the trespassing, the harassment, and the threats to take legal action against her farm. Maria listened carefully, then asked, "So you want to move Thunder and the others to the back section near the neighborhood?" "That's right. Is there any problem with that?" "Not from a veterinary standpoint," Maria said. "The grass is good back there and there's water access. The bulls will probably love having more room to roam. But Sarah, you know how protective they are. If strangers keep coming onto that land..." "I know exactly how protective they are," Sarah said with a smile in her voice. That's the point. Maria was quiet for a moment. Sarah, I have to ask, are you planning to use your bulls to scare those HOA people? I'm planning to move my livestock to a different section of my own property, Sarah said carefully. If some trespassers happen to encounter my bulls while they're illegally on my land, well, that's not my fault. Just be careful, Maria warned. Make sure your fences are secure. Make sure you have proper warning signs posted. And make sure you document everything in case there are legal questions later. Don't worry, Sarah said. I'm going to do this the right way. The next morning, Sarah drove to the farm supply store in town. She bought 4 new private property, no trespassing signs, 2 danger livestock signs, and 1 warning bulls in pasture sign. She also bought extra fence wire, new gate latches, and a small security camera. When she got home, Sarah spent the entire day preparing the back pasture. She reinforced every section of fence that looked even slightly weak. She installed new latches on all the gates. She posted the warning signs at every possible entry point to her property. Sarah also set up the security camera with a view of the area where the HOA people usually trespassed. If they came back and caused problems, she would have video evidence of everything that happened. Finally, Sarah walked the fence line one more time, making sure everything was perfect. The fence was strong enough to keep her bulls safely on her own property, but it wouldn't stop determined trespassers from climbing over it. The warning signs were clear and visible, but people who wanted to ignore them still could. As the sun was setting, Sarah looked at her 4 bulls grazing peacefully in their current pasture. Tomorrow they were going to get a lot more room to roam. And if Dennis Walsh and his HOA team decided to continue their harassment campaign, they were going to get a very big surprise. Sarah smiled as she watched Thunder lift his massive head and look toward the back of the property, almost like he could sense that changes were coming. Soon, the bulls would have new territory to protect. And soon, the HO people would learn what it really meant to trespass on a working cattle farm. The stage was set. The trap was ready. Now all Sarah had to do was wait for Dennis Walsh to make his next move. Early Sunday morning, Sarah walked out to the small pasture where her 4 bulls were waiting for breakfast. Thunder lifted his massive head and looked at her with those intelligent brown eyes. Lightning, storm, and tornado gathered around the fence, knowing that something different was about to happen. "Well, boys, today is moving day," Sarah said softly. "You're getting a bigger home with more grass and more room to run around, but you might also get some uninvited visitors, and I'm counting on you to handle them the way you always do." Thunder snorted and stamped his front hoof, almost like he understood exactly what Sarah was saying. The other bulls seemed excited, too, walking back and forth along the fence line. Moving 4 giant bulls wasn't easy work, but Sarah had done it before. She opened the gates between the pastures and used grain buckets to lead the bulls along the path to their new home. Thunder walked first, as always, with the other 3 following behind him in a line. When they reached the back pasture, all 4 bulls immediately began exploring their new territory. They sniffed the ground, tested the grass, and walked along the fence line that bordered the HOA neighborhood. Thunder seemed particularly interested in that back fence, standing there for several minutes just looking toward the fancy houses. Sarah watched them settle in, then went back to her house to wait. She knew Dennis Walsh would be back soon. For the past week, he had been coming every Tuesday and Thursday morning like clockwork. It was Tuesday, and Sarah was sure he wouldn't disappoint her. At exactly 9 o'clock, Sarah heard car doors slamming in the distance. She looked out her kitchen window and saw not 1 but 2 cars parked near her property line. Dennis Walsh was back, and this time he had brought even more people with him. Sarah counted 7 people total, including Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, the HOA president. They had cameras, measuring equipment, clipboards, and what looked like official, legal papers. Dennis was clearly planning something big. From her window, Sarah watched the group gather near her front fence. Dennis was pointing toward her house and barn, giving instructions to the others. Then he pointed toward the back of her property, where her new warning signs were clearly visible. "Let's start with the back section today," Sarah heard Dennis say. "I want to document everything along that fence line. If we're going to force her out, we need a complete record of all the violations." The group walked along Sarah's property line until they reached the back section. Sarah quickly moved to her back porch where she had a perfect view of what was about to happen. Her security camera was already recording everything. Dennis Walsh and his team completely ignored the new "no trespassing" signs. They walked right past the danger livestock warnings like they weren't even there. Mrs. Henderson actually laughed when she saw the warning "bulls in pasture" sign. "She thinks she can scare us with farm animals," Mrs. Henderson said loudly. "What a joke. We have legal authority here." The 7 HOA members climbed through Sarah's fence and spread out across the back pasture. Dennis pointed toward different areas and gave orders like he was commanding an army. 2 people started taking pictures of everything. 3 others began measuring distances with long tape measures. Mrs. Henderson and 1 other person started making a list of what they called violations. What none of them noticed was Thunder standing perfectly still behind a small group of oak trees about 50 yards away. The massive bull had heard the voices and was watching these strangers very carefully. His 3 companions were grazing nearby, but Thunder's stillness caught their attention too. For about 10 minutes, the HOA group continued their illegal inspection. They took pictures of Sarah's fence posts, measured the distance between her property and their neighborhood, and made notes about everything they saw. Dennis Walsh was particularly excited about something he found near the back corner of the pasture. "Perfect," Dennis said loudly. "This fence post is exactly 3 inches closer to our property line than county regulations allow. That's a clear violation we can use in court." Sarah almost laughed from her porch. The fence post Dennis was measuring had been there for over 10 years, long before the HOA neighborhood even existed, but she let him continue with his fake inspection. That's when Lightning decided to investigate these intruders. The younger bull walked out from behind another group of trees and stood in the open field about 30 yards from the HOA group. Lightning was curious about these strangers, but he wasn't happy about them being on his territory. One of the HOA members, a young man with expensive sneakers, noticed Lightning first. Dennis," he said nervously. "There's a cow over there." Dennis Walsh barely looked up from his measuring tape. "It's just a farm animal. Ignore it." But Lightning wasn't just any farm animal. He was 1,600 pounds of muscle and protective instinct. When the young man with sneakers took a step closer to get a better picture, Lightning lowered his head and made a deep, rumbling sound that echoed across the entire pasture. Now everyone in the HOA group was looking at Lightning. Mrs. Henderson stopped writing in her notebook. The people with cameras stopped taking pictures. Everyone suddenly realized that this farm animal was much bigger and much more intimidating than they had expected. "That's not a cow," whispered one of the women. "That's a bull." Before anyone could react, Storm appeared from a different direction. Then Tornado emerged from behind a small hill. Finally, Thunder stepped out from his hiding place behind the oak trees. 4 massive bulls now surrounded the HOA group in the middle of the pasture. Each bull weighed over 1,500 pounds. Each bull had horns that could easily hurt a person, and each bull was looking directly at these uninvited visitors with very unfriendly expressions. The smirks completely disappeared from every face in the HOA group. Dennis Walsh dropped his measuring tape. Mrs. Henderson actually took a step backward. The young man with expensive sneakers looked like he might start crying. Thunder, the leader of the bulls, began walking slowly toward the group. Every step he took made the ground shake slightly. His massive head was lowered and his dark eyes were focused entirely on Dennis Walsh. "Nobody move," Dennis whispered, but his voice was shaking with fear. "Just stay very still." Lightning positioned himself on the left side of the group. Storm moved to the right side. Tornado, the youngest and most energetic bull, seemed excited by all the activity and started pawing the ground with his front hooves. The HOA group was now trapped in the middle of Sarah's pasture, surrounded by 4 angry bulls who clearly didn't want them there. The fancy clothes, expensive equipment, and official badges suddenly didn't seem very important anymore. From her porch, Sarah could see the panic in their eyes. These people who had been so confident and arrogant just minutes ago were now terrified and helpless. They had ignored her warnings, trespassed on her property, and disturbed her animals. Now they were about to learn what happens when you mess with a cattle farmer and her bulls. For what felt like forever, nobody moved. The 7 HOA members stood frozen in the middle of the pasture while 4 massive bulls stared at them with unfriendly eyes. Thunder, the biggest bull, was now only 15 feet away from Dennis Walsh. The giant animal's breathing was loud and heavy, and steam came from his nostrils in the cool morning air. Dennis Walsh, who had been so confident and bossy just minutes before, was now sweating and shaking. His expensive clothes were already dirty from walking through the pasture, and his perfectly styled hair was messy from the morning breeze. The clipboard he always carried was lying on the ground where he had dropped it. "What do we do?" whispered Mrs. Henderson, the HOA president. Her voice was so quiet that even the people standing next to her could barely hear her. "I don't know," Dennis whispered back. "I've never dealt with wild animals before." Lightning, the fastest bull, seemed to find their whispering interesting. He tilted his massive head to one side like he was trying to understand what these strangers were saying. Then he took 3 slow steps closer to the group. One of the younger HOA members, a woman with blonde hair, started to panic. "They're going to attack us," she said, her voice getting louder. "We need to run." "Don't run," Dennis hissed. "Running will make them chase us." But it was too late. The blonde woman had already started walking quickly toward the fence. As she moved, all 4 bulls turned their attention to her. Thunder let out a deep booming sound that was part moo and part roar. The sound was so loud that birds flew out of nearby trees. The woman stopped walking and started crying. "I want to go home," she sobbed. "I just want to go home." From her back porch, Sarah could see everything that was happening. She could have let the situation continue, but she wasn't a cruel person. Her goal was to teach these trespassers a lesson, not to actually hurt anyone. She walked to the edge of her porch and called out across the pasture. "Stop moving around so much," Sarah shouted. "Bulls don't like quick movements. Walk very slowly toward the fence and don't make any loud noises." Dennis Walsh looked toward Sarah with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Call off your animals," he yelled. "They're not attack dogs," Sarah replied calmly. "They're bulls and you're on their territory without permission. Just walk slowly and quietly toward the fence." Mrs. Henderson, despite being terrified, was still trying to act important. "This is illegal," she shouted at Sarah. "You can't use dangerous animals to threaten people." Sarah smiled and held up her phone. "I've been recording everything with my security camera. You ignored multiple warning signs, climbed through my fence, and trespassed on my property. My bulls are just protecting their home." Thunder seemed to understand that Sarah was talking to these strangers. He looked toward the porch where Sarah was standing, then back at the HOA group. The massive bull took one more step toward Dennis. Walsh close enough that Dennis could smell the animal's breath. Okay, Dennis said quietly. "We're leaving. We're walking to the fence right now." The HOA group began the longest, most terrifying walk of their lives. They moved as slowly as they could, trying not to make any sudden movements. Thunder followed directly behind Dennis Walsh, staying about 10 feet away. Lightning walked alongside, the group on the left side. Storm positioned himself on the right side. Tornado, the youngest bull, seemed to be enjoying himself and kept making playful charging motions that sent waves of panic through the trespassers. Every step felt like it. Took forever. When someone stumbled slightly, all 4 bulls would stop and stare until the person regained their balance. When Mrs. Henderson's phone rang, the sudden noise made Thunder snort loudly, which caused 3 people to nearly faint from fear. It took almost 15 minutes for the group to walk the 100 yards to the fence. By the time they reached the property line, all 7 HOA members were covered in sweat, dirt, and grass stains. Their expensive clothes were ruined. Their perfect hair was messy. Their confident attitudes had completely disappeared. Dennis Walsh was the first person to climb through the fence. He moved faster than Sarah had ever seen anyone move, practically throwing himself over the fence rails. Mrs. Henderson was right, behind him, forgetting all about her dignity as she scrambled to safety. The other 5 HOA members followed quickly, leaving behind their cameras, measuring equipment, and clipboards in their rush to escape. Once they were all safely on the other side of the fence, they stood there breathing heavily, and staring at the 4 bulls who were now calmly grazing as if nothing had happened. Dennis Walsh tried to regain some of his authority. "This isn't over," he shouted across the fence at Sarah. "We'll call the police, we'll sue you, we'll have those dangerous animals removed." Sarah walked over to the fence, still holding her phone with the video recording. "Go ahead and call anyone you want," she said calmly. "But remember, I have video proof that you trespassed on my property after ignoring multiple warning signs. I also have witnesses who saw you harassing me for weeks." She held up her phone so they could see the screen. "This video shows everything that happened today. 7 adults illegally entered private property, ignored safety warnings, and disturbed livestock. My bulls never left my property, never attacked anyone, and never caused any injuries. They just did what bulls naturally do when strangers invade their territory." Mrs. Henderson's face was red with embarrassment and anger. "Your property values are still a problem for our neighborhood." "My property values?" Sarah laughed. "Lady, I've been here for 8 years. Your neighborhood has been here for 2 years. I was here first, and I'll be here long after you're gone." Dennis Walsh gathered up his remaining dignity and tried one more threat. "The county will hear about this. The HOA has connections." "Good," Sarah said. "When you talk to the county, make sure you mention that you've been trespassing on my land, multiple times taking pictures without permission and harassing a local business owner. I'm sure they'll be very interested in that information." The HOA group walked back to their cars in defeat. Their expensive equipment was still scattered around Sarah's pasture, but none of them were brave enough to go back and get it. As they drove away, Sarah could see them arguing with each other through the car windows. Thunder walked over to the fence where Sarah was standing. The giant bull gently bumped her shoulder with his massive head, like he was asking if he had done a good job. "Perfect work, Thunder," Sarah said, scratching behind his ears. "You and the boys handled that exactly right." Over the next few days, Sarah waited for the police or county officials to show up, but no one came. She later heard through her neighbor Bob that Dennis Walsh had quietly resigned from the HOA Compliance Committee. Mrs. Henderson had also stepped down as HOA president, claiming she wanted to focus on other priorities. The expensive equipment the HOA group had left behind was still sitting in Sarah's pasture a week later. She finally called the HOA office and offered to return it, but they told her to keep it or throw it away. Apparently, none of them wanted to risk another encounter with thunder, lightning, storm, and tornado. Sarah's peaceful farm life returned to normal. Her bulls continued to graze happily in their expanded pasture, and no more uninvited visitors ever crossed her fence. Word spread quickly through the area about what had happened, and Sarah became something of a local legend. The moral of the story was simple. If you're going to trespass on a cattle farm and ignore warning signs, you better be prepared to meet the bulls.